Sign or fall. Choose.
Sign or fall. Choose. My husband said it like he was closing a meeting 4 words flat against the morning fog while he slid a pen across the documents he had laid out on the rock at the edge of the cliff. Lydia stood 3 feet behind him, blocking the only trail back. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just watched me the way you watch something you've already decided to let go. I had built ArcLight Surgical Systems from nothing. I had given both of them everything: access, authority, trust, years of my life. And somewhere in those years, they had decided that the simplest solution was to make sure I couldn't take any of it back. They watched me fall. They told the world I was gone. They started dividing what was mine before my name was cold. So what happens when a dead woman walks back in? If you want to find out how this ends, and trust me, you do make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Stories like this one drop every week and you won't want to miss what comes next. The thing about that pen. The one Gavin slid across the rock toward me that morning was that it was mine. A matte black rollerball I had carried for years, the kind with enough weight to feel deliberate in your hand. He had taken it from my desk at some point, probably weeks earlier, and I hadn't noticed it was gone. That detail came back to me much later, long after everything else had already fallen into place, and it struck me as the most honest summary of what our marriage had actually been. He had been taking things from my desk for years, and I had been too busy building the next thing to notice what was already missing. I built ArcLight Surgical Systems from a rented lab space and a patent application I had revised 47 times. The first hospital to install our guidance system was a regional trauma center in Central California, the kind of facility that couldn't staff a full neurosurgical team, but still received patients who needed one. I remember standing in the observation bay during the first procedure that used our equipment, watching the guidance arm move with a precision that no exhausted human hand could replicate at that hour of the night, and thinking about my father. He had died on a table in a regional hospital outside San Aurelia when I was 16. Not because the surgeon was careless, but because the tools in that room weren't built for what that moment required. The attending physician called it a complication. What he meant was that the gap between what medicine knew how to do and what the available equipment allowed was too wide, and my father fell into it. I had spent 20 years trying to close that gap. ArcLight was the result. By the time Gavin Rusk came into my life, the company had outgrown the version of itself I had originally imagined. There were board members now, acquisition offers, patent disputes from competitors who understood that what we had built was worth more than we were charging for it. Gavin was the opposing counsel in one of those disputes, sharp, methodical, the kind of lawyer who reads the power structure of a room before he reads the brief on the table. We spent 4 months across conference tables from each other, and when the case settled in our favor, I expected him to return to his firm and move on to the next engagement. Instead, he called and asked whether I had ever considered building a proper legal department from the inside, rather than outsourcing every dispute to outside counsel. What I remember most about those early months with Gavin wasn't his intelligence, though he was genuinely intelligent. It was the quality of his attention. He seemed to notice the parts of the work that no one else saw, the fatigue behind the decisions, the particular loneliness of being the person everyone looks to when something breaks. He had a way of showing up at exactly the right moment, not dramatically but consistently, like someone who had studied the schedule carefully. I mistook that consistency for love. After 3 years together, I married him, gave him a vice president title, and handed him access to a life I had built entirely on my own. I should have understood from the way he had read that first conference room that Gavin always entered a space by locating where the leverage was. Lydia Fenner had come to ArcLight 2 years before Gavin. She was 26 at the time, and what distinguished her from the other candidates we reviewed that spring wasn't her credentials. It was the quality of her questions. Most people her age wanted to demonstrate capability. Lydia wanted to understand architecture. She asked about how our financial structure would scale if we moved into international markets, about where the load-bearing walls were in the company's capital model. I recognized something in that instinct, brought her on directly, and spent the next 6 years giving her more access and more responsibility than I had given almost anyone else in the organization. By the time I promoted her to CFO, Lydia knew the Hensley Founder Trust better than most of the attorneys who had drafted it. She had the account structures, the investment strategies, and the approval protocols for every significant transaction the company ran. I thought I was developing her. I was in fact giving her the complete map. I don't know exactly when Gavin and Lydia started. The timeline doesn't matter as much as what they built together alongside the relationship, something quieter and more deliberate than an affair. They had reached a shared conclusion somewhere in the years of off-site trips and closed-door strategy sessions that I was holding more than my share and that they were being compensated inadequately for their contributions. Gavin believed he had sacrificed a genuine partnership track at his former firm in order to protect ArcLight's legal interests. Lydia believed the financial engine she had constructed deserved recognition that a salary couldn't capture. Neither of them seemed to consider that what they were describing as sacrifice and contribution was simply the work they had been hired and generously compensated to do. The resentment they developed in private eventually became a methodology. They began moving money through consulting fee structures and international supply contracts, transaction types that looked routine inside a company of ArcLight's scale. The amounts were sized carefully, significant enough to accumulate, contained enough not to trigger automated compliance flags. Over nearly 3 years, close to $40 million left the company through channels that routed to accounts Gavin controlled and to funds registered under the names of Lydia's relatives. They were patient and precise, and they had learned to replicate my electronic approval signature well enough to clear internal review. For a long time, it worked exactly as they had designed it to. The audit that surfaced the problem wasn't one I had ordered with this in mind. It was a standard quarterly compliance review, and the junior analyst who flagged it did so because the approval timestamps on a series of vendor payments didn't align with my documented travel schedule. She brought the discrepancy directly to me rather than to Lydia instinct or luck or some combination of both. I told her to close the file, say nothing, and return to her desk. Then I called Phoebe Larkin. Phoebe had spent a decade running financial investigations for a federal securities regulator before going independent. She operated entirely outside ArcLight's internal networks, which was precisely what I needed. Within 6 weeks, she had traced the outgoing funds through their layered structures back to a private investment vehicle that Gavin had incorporated under a holding name I didn't recognize. The accounts connected to Lydia's family were structured more carefully, but the pattern was unmistakable once you knew where to look. I had the complete picture on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for an hour before I moved. What stopped me from calling Jonas immediately wasn't fear. It was the recognition that speed would cost me everything. Gavin had full access to ArcLight's corporate legal network. Lydia controlled the financial systems. If I made noise before I had secured what mattered, they would have the evidence cleaned and a counter-narrative constructed before I could speak clearly enough for anyone to hear me. So I did the opposite of what I wanted to do. I called Jonas Crew at his private number, told him to prepare divorce filings, and instructed him to begin drafting an amendment to the Hensley Founder Trust that would remove Gavin's right to receive any voting authority in the event of my death or incapacitation. I also scheduled a full board presentation for the following week, at which I intended to lay out Phoebe's findings directly. The amendment was set to be signed on a Monday morning. What I didn't know was that someone inside Jonas's office was feeding information to Gavin. I still don't know how long that arrangement had been in place. But by the time Gavin understood what I was doing, that I was simultaneously severing the inheritance clause, filing for divorce, and moving toward a criminal referral, he had fewer than 72 hours before the documents would be executed and beyond his reach. He came to me on a Thursday evening with a suggestion. Our anniversary was approaching, he said. He thought we should go somewhere quiet away from the office, somewhere we could have a real conversation without everything else pressing in around us. He said the name Solstice Bluff Lodge with a particular kind of calm, and I watched his face while he said it and understood that whatever he was proposing, it was not a conversation. I agreed to go anyway. I went because I needed to understand exactly how much he knew and because I still wanted, despite everything Phoebe had shown me, to find a version of events in which I had misread something important. Before we left, I sent Phoebe a copy of the core financial documentation and asked Jonas to have the trust amendment ready for my signature the moment I returned. And before I walked out of my office for what I didn't yet know would be the last time as a person, the world believed to be alive. I fastened the Guardian around my neck, a prototype biosensor. ArcLight's engineering team had been developing for surgical field use. It looked like a flat oval pendant. It recorded audio and biometric data, and it was designed to sync automatically to an independent backup server whenever it detected a significant cardiac event or trauma signature. The server ran on architecture that predated ArcLight's current IT infrastructure, entirely separate from the main network. Only I had the authentication credentials to access it. I told myself the Guardian was a precaution. I didn't let myself finish the thought about what I was taking precautions against. Solstice Bluff Lodge sat at the northern edge of Astor Point Preserve where the California coast turns steep, and the fog arrives by morning thick enough to make the cliff's edge invisible from 15 feet back. Gavin had reserved the full guest wing and asked the staff not to disturb us. That detail told me everything, though I filed it away quietly. The first evening was convincing in the way that a rehearsed performance can be convincing when the performer is skilled enough. He was attentive, reflective, said things that sounded like a man trying to understand where a marriage had drifted. I let him perform it. I listened and watched his hands and contributed very little. The next morning, he suggested a walk along the preserve trail. The path cuts through coastal scrub before opening onto a viewpoint at the cliff's edge, and I had walked it before years earlier before any of this. I followed him without hesitation. When I came around the last bend and saw Lydia standing at the viewpoint, composed, waiting, not remotely surprised by my presence, I understood that there had never been a conversation planned. She didn't apologize and didn't pretend. She said in the tone of someone stating an institutional conclusion that I had built something too large and had never developed the judgment to share it appropriately. Gavin took a folded set of documents from inside his jacket and laid them against the rock at the cliff's edge. The terms were clear. I would transfer my voting rights at ArcLight to him and sign a statement clearing Lydia of any involvement in the financial irregularities under internal review. In exchange, they would allow an uncontested divorce and permit me to retain a portion of my personal assets. I looked at the two of them standing between me and the only path back through the preserve. I thought about my father and the hospital corridor and the 47 drafts of a patent application, and every morning I had unlocked the door of a building that existed because I had refused to stop building it. Then I picked up the documents and tore them in half. What happened in the next 60 seconds I have recounted to investigators enough times that the sequence has become almost abstract. My weight against the cliff face, my fingers around the root that jutted from the rock below the edge, the fog so dense I couldn't see the water beneath me. Gavin stood above and looked down at me with the expression of a man running a calculation he had already run many times before in private. I asked him to pull me up. His face didn't change. Lydia spoke before he moved. She said that if I survived, everything they had built over the past 3 years would be gone within a week. She said it the way you'd state a consequence in a risk assessment, no heat in it, just clarity. Gavin took my wrist in both hands. Not to pull, to work. One finger at a time, the way he approached every problem he had ever decided to solve until there was nothing left to hold. And the fog took me. And the last image I carried down with me was the outline of his shoulders against a gray sky, already straightening, already turning back toward the trail. I don't know how long I was in the water. What I know is that I came back to consciousness on a narrow cot in a room that smelled of salt and antiseptic, with gray light coming through a single window and the sound of gulls somewhere beyond the wall. My ribs felt like broken crockery shifted with every breath. My left hand was bandaged from the wrist to the knuckle. When I tried to sit up, the room tilted so severely that I had to press both palms flat against the mattress just to stay oriented. A woman's voice told me to lie back down, and I did because I didn't have the strength to do otherwise, and because I couldn't remember in that moment whether I was the kind of person who would argue. I couldn't remember much of anything at all. The woman was Iris Weller, though I wouldn't know her name for several more hours. She had found me along with her son Holden, caught in the mouth of a sea cave a few kilometers south of the preserve's mapped coastline, well outside the boundary of any active search operation. Iris had worked as a nurse for most of her adult life before relocating to the fishing village where she now lived, and she recognized the signs of someone who had every physiological reason to no longer be alive but wasn't. She and Holden moved me out of the cave and into her truck without contacting anyone official, because the way I had been lying there, no bag, no phone, no identification, bruising distributed in patterns that didn't suggest an accident, made her decide that the most protective thing she could do was keep me quiet until I could make my own decisions about who to tell. When I was finally capable of speech, I couldn't answer the most basic question she asked. This is the part that is hardest to explain accurately. It wasn't amnesia the way it appears in films, a clean erasure, a blank slate. It was more like the connective tissue between memories had been severed while the memories themselves remained. I knew how to read. I knew the terminology of surgical instrumentation without being able to explain why. I could calculate compound interest in my head and identify instinctively the line in a financial report where something was being obscured. But when Iris asked me my name, I reached for it and found nothing attached. Not absence, more like a familiar hallway where the door you expected simply wasn't there anymore. What surfaced instead were fragments with no labels. A pair of hands that I understood were mine signing something at a wide desk. A logo I recognized without being able to name. The specific quality of wind moving across exposed stone. And one physical sensation that returned regardless of how I tried to redirect my attention, the feeling of my own fingers being separated from something I was gripping. Not released, not slipped, removed with intention, one at a time. I would wake in the night with that sensation present enough that I would check my hands in the dark to confirm they were still there. Iris gave me the room at the back of her house near the water and asked nothing she didn't need to know. Holden converted a storage space into something livable and helped me through the early physical therapy with a patience I had no way to account for, given that I was a stranger with no explanation for my presence on their coastline. For the first weeks, my entire world was that room, the short hallway and the kitchen table where Iris sat with me 3 times a day and let the silence be comfortable. It was the first time in longer than I could measure that no one needed anything from me. I had no idea during those weeks that someone who shared my face was being publicly mourned 200 miles south. Gavin had constructed the narrative with the same methodical care he brought to everything. He told reporters about a marriage that had been quietly under strain, nothing dramatic, nothing that would invite scrutiny, just the kind of private distance that a sympathetic audience would recognize as human. He described a wife who had been drinking lightly the night before, who had gone out alone in the morning fog to walk the shoreline, who had always been drawn to isolated places when she needed to think. The search team recovered a coat near the cliff's edge, 1 shoe, and a bloodstain on the rock that forensic analysis confirmed as consistent with the missing person. No body was found, but the current patterns along that section of coast were well documented, and the conclusion was not difficult to reach. After 6 days, the search was suspended. Olivia Hensley had fallen from Astor Point Preserve and been carried out to sea. The finding was accepted without significant challenge, and Gavin accepted the condolences of an entire city with the composure of a man who had been preparing for a loss he couldn't have anticipated. Lydia stood beside him at the public memorial with the expression of someone grieving a mentor. She was very convincing. I know because I watched the footage later. By the time I was strong enough to walk to the end of Iris's dock without stopping, Gavin had assumed temporary voting authority over Arclight, and Lydia had been installed as acting chief executive. They moved carefully through those first months, dismissing the senior staff most aligned with my direct oversight, replacing them with people whose loyalty could be more easily managed. Transferring the most valuable patents into a subsidiary entity registered under a name that would mean nothing to anyone outside their immediate circle. They were doing exactly what I would have expected them to do, and they were doing it well. But the Hensley Founder Trust contained a clause I had written in myself years earlier, specifically to prevent a panicked or self-interested transfer in a crisis. A missing person's assets could not be permanently conveyed for a full year following the date of disappearance. Gavin had 11 months of temporary authority before he could consolidate anything permanently. He intended to use that time to make the consolidation as seamless as possible. I spent 8 of those 11 months not knowing any of this. The memory came back, the way a returning tide covers ground, not as a single event, but as an accumulation incremental enough that you don't recognize the extent of what has returned until you look down and realize the landscape has changed entirely. I was at the village clinic for a routine follow-up when I saw it, a surgical guidance arm older generation mounted to a portable chassis in the corridor outside an examination room. The ArcLight logo was positioned low on the housing near the base where most people would never look. I saw it from across the hallway and something in my chest locked with a recognition that arrived faster than language. I crossed the corridor and put my hand flat against the logo. It returned in no particular sequence, and with no consideration for what I was ready to receive. A rented laboratory with water-damaged ceiling tiles. The exact wording of a patent claim revised until the language was precise enough to hold. A conference room and the opposing counsel across the table and the specific way he adjusted his jacket before he spoke, a habit I had watched for 4 months before I understood what it signaled. A woman 26 years old and precise in her questions sitting across from me in an interview. A cliff face in dense fog, a set of documents pressed flat against stone, and a pair of hands I had believed until the final moment would make a different decision. I sat down on the floor of that clinic hallway and stayed there for a long time. Iris drove me home. Holden made tea and said nothing, which was the correct response. When I could hold a phone steadily enough to use it, I searched my own name. The volume of results wasn't surprising. I had understood beneath the surface of everything I couldn't consciously access that the world had been informed of my death. What I had not prepared for was the specific image that loaded first Gavin seated behind my desk in my office, wearing the watch I had given him for our 2nd anniversary, telling a reporter that he was committed to honoring my vision for ArcLight. He used the word legacy 4 times in 3 minutes. He was exceptionally good at it, and watching him perform it from inside my borrowed life on a borrowed phone made something settle into place inside me that had been unmoored since I woke up on Iris's cot. I understood watching that interview that coming forward immediately was the wrong move. Iris had already arrived at the same conclusion and laid it out plainly when I told her what I had remembered. Gavin controlled ArcLight's legal infrastructure, the public narrative, and the goodwill of a city that had watched him grieve. If I walked into a police station as an unidentified woman with documented memory impairment claiming to be the dead billionaire whose husband was now operating her company, I would be held for psychiatric evaluation before Jonas could respond to a call. I needed Jonas first, and I needed to reach him without Gavin knowing I was alive. I used a borrowed laptop and an encrypted channel to send Jonas a private verification sequence, a string of characters we had established years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency used once before during a sensitive contract dispute that couldn't leave a readable trail. Jonas didn't respond for 6 hours. When he did, his reply was a single word asking for a location. I gave him the name of the nearest town and a public library address. 2 days later, he was sitting across from me in a reading room above the stacks, looking at me the way a person looks at something they want very badly to believe but are afraid to get wrong. I told him the contents of a will that had never been filed, a document in a single handwritten draft held in a private safe that only the 2 of us had ever known existed. The color receded from his face in the slow, specific way of someone receiving information that rearranges everything. He arranged a DNA sample through a private laboratory with no connection to ArcLight or to anyone in Gavin's professional network. The result came back within 72 hours. The woman in that reading room was Olivia Hensley. Jonas told me the timeline. Fewer than 4 months remained before the trust's 1-year threshold converted Gavin's temporary authority into something effectively permanent. A memorial ceremony was being organized for the exact anniversary of my disappearance, after which the board was expected to ratify his full control without further procedural delay. Jonas wanted to surface my existence immediately, file emergency motions contact. The board directly go public through channels that Gavin couldn't intercept. I told him no. Proving I was alive would halt the asset transfer. It would not prove that Gavin and Lydia had stood at that cliff and made the decision they made. The moment I reappeared, they would have whatever time remained before legal proceedings began to destroy what was left of the evidence trail and build a version of events in which I had engineered my own disappearance, suffered a mental collapse, or was being used by someone with a financial interest in destabilizing the company. Gavin was capable of making that story, convincing he had already demonstrated as much, and I wasn't willing to give him the runway to do it again. I needed them to keep believing I was dead. and I needed what they said and did under that belief to be documented before they learned otherwise. Jonas secured a safe apartment outside San Aurelia and brought Phoebe back into the operation. She had preserved the core financial documents I had sent her before the trip to Solstice Bluff, though she had been careful not to take any active investigative steps after my disappearance, knowing that visible activity could be traced back to her and used to discredit whatever she produced. Together, the three of us began reconstructing the evidence from what remained. The work was slower than I wanted because Gavin and Lydia had spent 11 months methodically cleaning the most accessible records. The transaction logs with my replicated approval signatures, the clearest direct evidence of the embezzlement, had been scrubbed from ArcLight's internal servers within weeks of my disappearance. What Phoebe found instead was a plan for what came next. By mapping the current movement of ArcLight's patent portfolio against the corporate filings of a series of recently incorporated holding entities, she was able to reconstruct what Gavin intended to do the moment the board ratified his authority. He planned to liquidate a specific set of ArcLight's foundational patents, the ones I had spent a decade filing, defending, and building the company's core technical identity around, and move the proceeds into a private offshore fund. Once the money was positioned outside domestic reach, the remaining documentation pointing to the embezzlement would surface with Lydia's name structurally attached to the liability. Gavin would present himself as the betrayed widower who had placed too much trust in the wrong colleague. Lydia would absorb the legal consequences. Gavin would leave with the assets and enough reputational cover to rebuild. I had never intended to share any of it with her. She was the contingency plan, the same way I had been a name to attach to the problem when the problem needed to belong to someone else. It was Holden who located the Guardian. He had kept the jacket I was wearing when they pulled me from the cave. Iris had washed and folded it carefully, the way you preserve something belonging to a person whose circumstances you don't yet fully understand, and when he checked the lining while repairing a torn inner seam, the device was still there, lodged in the padding near the collar. The casing was cracked and the clasp broken, but the internal components were built to the same impact-resistant standard we used in surgical field equipment. Phoebe understood immediately that the device itself was secondary. What mattered was whether the sink had fired before I hit the water. The Guardian's field protocol included an automatic transmission function designed for exactly the conditions under which it had been used when the biosensor registered a significant trauma event. It pushed a compressed data package to a backup server that ArcLight's original engineering team had built into the system during the company's earliest phase, before the infrastructure had grown complex enough to require formal IT management. That server sat on its own architecture, connected to nothing in ArcLight's current network, accessible only through a biometric authentication sequence tied to my personal credentials, combined with a founder-level passcode. Gavin and Lydia had destroyed the device. They had never known there was a server to find. I gave Phoebe the authentication sequence and the passcode from memory, the kind of numbers you don't write down because they're too fundamental to the thing you built to ever actually forget. She accessed the server. She found the file. 4 minutes and 22 seconds of audio, beginning with the sound of wind moving across stone at a cliff's edge and ending after the impact, and the long interval that followed with Gavin's voice arriving from somewhere above and to the left of where I had landed. Unhurried practical, already accounting for what came next. We listened to it once together in that apartment. Then Phoebe closed the file, and the look she gave me across the table told me everything I needed to know about what we had and what it would require to make it count. I was still working out the details of how to use it when Gavin found us. Gavin found us the way he found most things, not through force, but through patience and a well-placed source. A junior associate in Jonas's office had been on Gavin's payroll for longer than any of us knew. He hadn't understood what he was looking at initially when Jonas began routing communications through an encrypted channel to an unregistered device originating somewhere along the northern coast. But when Jonas started placing calls to a private laboratory and then re-establishing contact with Phoebe, the pattern became legible to anyone paying close enough attention. By the time we had listened to the 4 minutes and 22 seconds of audio from the Guardian server and were beginning to map out how to deploy it, Gavin's private security team had already identified the apartment. They came in the early hours of the morning when the boundary between alertness and sleep is at its most permeable. They took Phoebe's laptop, the external drive she had been using to reconstruct the financial trail, and every physical document we had accumulated over the preceding weeks. Phoebe tried to hold on to one of the drives and was thrown hard enough against the doorframe to need stitches above her eyebrow. Jonas was collected separately from his home, walked out under a fabricated charge of stealing proprietary trade information from ArcLight, a claim that had apparently been prepared in advance as a contingency measure ready to deploy the moment it became necessary. It was entirely false and would eventually be dismantled, but it was sufficient to hold him for days while the clock kept moving in the direction Gavin needed it to move. I was not in the apartment when they arrived. I had driven back to Iris's house the previous evening to tell her that things were nearing a conclusion and to give her and Holden the chance to make informed decisions about their own safety. That absence was the only reason the night ended the way it did for me, rather than the way it ended for Phoebe and Jonas. Gavin came to the empty apartment the following afternoon. He knew I would return to assess what remained, and he was right. When I let myself in through the service entrance and found him standing in the gutted main room with the particular composure of a man who has already decided how the conversation ends, I understood that he had not come to negotiate. He looked well. That was the first thing I registered, not with surprise, but with a kind of grim recognition. He was rested and precisely put together in the way of someone who had successfully filed away the difficult parts of the past year and was now operating from what he considered stable ground. He didn't revisit the cliff. He didn't explain or justify. He simply told me that he had spent close to a year building a life that functioned, and that my continued existence, while inconvenient, didn't have to translate into the destruction of everything he had constructed. He used the word inconvenient the way you'd use it for a scheduling conflict, no weight on it, no acknowledgement of what the word was being asked to carry. His offer was specific: a substantial wire transfer to an account under whatever name I chose, a complete identity package documentation that his contacts could produce to a standard that would survive any routine verification. I could go anywhere in the world, he said, and he would ensure that no one came looking for a dead woman. All he required in return was that I remove myself permanently from San Aurelia, from any legal or financial proceeding connected to ArcLight, and from any version of the future in which I existed as Olivia Hensley. I looked at him across the stripped room and understood with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel that he believed this was a reasonable offer. Not a compromise. A reasonable offer. That more than anything he had done at the cliff told me everything true about who Gavin Rusk had always been. I told him no. His expression didn't shift. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folder which he set on the counter between us without ceremony. Inside was a DNA analysis report issued on the letterhead of a certified forensic facility with established court standing, not the private laboratory Jonas had used, but an institution whose findings carried legal weight. According to the document, the DNA sample collected from the woman currently presenting herself as Olivia Hensley did not match the reference profile held in the state registry. The report was dated 4 days prior. It had been constructed using a sample Gavin's team had obtained through means I preferred not to examine too closely, cross-referenced against a reference file that had been quietly amended in the registry database at some point during the preceding months. Legally and technically, the document said I was not who I was. I walked me through what would happen if I appeared at the memorial. His security team would intercept me before I cleared the entrance. When police were called, they would find a woman with no verifiable identity and no credible documentation attempting to disrupt a private ceremony contradicted by certified forensic evidence. He had already secured statements from 2 board members attesting that someone matching my description had made threatening and erratic contact with ArcLight's leadership in recent weeks. And Iris and Holden, he said their names in the same unhurried tone he used for everything which was more effective than any raised voice, would face serious criminal exposure for harboring a missing person obstructing a death investigation, and what his attorneys would characterize as an attempt to defraud the estate of a deceased individual. Before he left, he told me that Lydia had personally destroyed the Guardian's memory card. Every piece of evidence connected to what had happened at Astor Point was gone. He set the folder on the counter and walked out without looking back, which was, I realized, exactly the way he had walked away from the cliff. That night I drove back to the village. I sat at Iris's kitchen table for a long time without saying much. listening to the ocean moving in the dark outside the window. That low, unbroken sound it makes at night that is different in quality from how it sounds during the day. I told her everything. The offer, the fabricated DNA results, the threats against her and Holden, and the fact that according to every official record that existed, I was not a person anymore. I told her that disappearing was a real option and that I understood completely if that was what she needed me to do. Iris listened without interruption. When I finished, she asked me one question: if I took Gavin's offer and stepped into the identity he was prepared to hand me, would I be free? Or would I simply be living out the rest of my life inside the story he had written? The question found something I had been carefully not looking at for weeks. Gavin didn't only want Arclight. He wanted to be the author of what my life had meant. He wanted the version of history in which I was a tragedy, a driven woman who had pushed herself past her limits, lost her footing at the edge of a cliff, and been carried out to sea, and he was the devoted steward who had carried her vision forward at great personal cost. He wanted my name on a memorial wall, my patents in his portfolio, my company in his hands, and the world's sympathy in his corner. If I vanished into whatever name he provided, I would be making that version of events permanent. Every trace of Olivia Hensley that remained in the world would be the one he had constructed. I told Iris I was going to the memorial. It was Holden who reminded me the following morning that the server had never been touched. The raid had taken Phoebe's hardware and every physical copy of the financial documentation, but the Guardian's backup server, running on its own isolated architecture inaccessible to anyone without my biometric credentials and the founder passcode, was exactly where it had always been. Gavin had destroyed the device. It had never occurred to him that there was a server to look for, because that server had been built before Arclight was large enough to have an IT department, and the only person who had ever known it existed was the person who had built the company around it. Phoebe had left the hospital that morning against her doctor's recommendation, with stitches above her eyebrow and a decisiveness that made the attending physician's objections feel beside the point. Before the raid, she had taken the precaution of uploading the most critical materials, including the documentation, demonstrating that the charges being prepared against Jonas were fabricated to a private encrypted cloud account she maintained entirely separate from her work devices. From her hospital bed, she had transmitted that material to a federal contact she had maintained since her years at the regulatory agency. The charges against Jonas collapsed faster than Gavin's legal team could construct a replacement, and Jonas walked out of custody within hours and called me before he had reached the sidewalk. He had already begun filing emergency motions to suspend all asset transfers challenging the death presumption, underlying the trust mechanism on the basis of credible evidence that the missing person was alive and present. He had also arranged for an independent DNA verification team drawn from a laboratory with no prior connection to Arclight, to Gavin, or to any facility Gavin had ever engaged to be present at the Glass House Pavilion, with a court-recognized mandate to conduct on-site authentication. Phoebe, meanwhile, accessed the Guardian server remotely, using the credentials I provided over a secure line. The file was intact. 4 minutes and 22 seconds undisturbed. The question of where to play it had already been resolved by Gavin's own choice of venue. The Glass House Pavilion ran a full integrated audio system used for investor presentations and board sessions, accessible from an input panel mounted near the rear of the main hall. I arrived before the doors opened through the service entrance. The room was already being prepared. Chairs arranged, flowers positioned, the technical equipment running through its pre-event checks. A large portrait of me had been mounted above the stage, formal and well-lit, taken at an Arclight product launch 3 years before. I looked at it briefly from across the room. Holden connected Phoebe's secure device to the audio input panel, confirmed the signal was live, and left the way we had come. Then I found a position near the back of the hall, close enough to the stage to see clearly, but not immediately visible from the entrance, and I waited. The room filled with the people Gavin had cultivated over a year of careful grief, adjacent relationship management board members, institutional investors, hospital executives, journalists who had written sympathetically about the tragedy of his loss. He arrived with Lydia at a time calibrated to signal both importance and humility. She wore dark, understated clothing. He wore the watch I had given him for our second anniversary still on his wrist, with the easy familiarity of something long owned. He took the stage and spoke about loss with a fluency that could only come from repetition. The same cadences, the same weight on the same words, the same slight downward angle of the head at the moments requiring the appearance of grief. He said my name beautifully. The board chair rose to begin the ratification process that would convert 11 months of temporary authority into something no one in that room was expecting to reverse. I walked in from the side aisle. The stillness that moved through the room was not dramatic. It was the particular quiet of a large group of people simultaneously encountering something that their understanding of events had made impossible. It traveled from the people nearest me outward in a visible wave until it reached the stage, and I watched Gavin register it first in Lydia's face before he turned to find its source. His recovery was fast. I had always admired his recovery time. He told the room I was an imposter and directed his security team forward. I read aloud the board's emergency founder verification code, a sequence established at ArcLights Incorporation that only the original founder and the seated board chair had ever been given. The board chair lifted his hand and told the security team to stop moving. Jonas came through the main doors carrying a court order suspending all asset transfers issued that morning on the basis of a direct challenge to the death presumption underlying the trust. A court-appointed officer walked beside him. The independent DNA team set up near the side wall and ran the verification. 11 minutes. When the result was confirmed and read into the record, the board chair sat down in his chair and remained there without speaking. Gavin made one final argument. He cited his fabricated DNA report and suggested the court would need to reconcile conflicting forensic documentation before treating any of this as procedurally settled. His voice was completely steady. I walked to the input panel at the rear of the hall and pressed play. The room heard wind first, then my voice at the cliff refusing, then Lydia's voice stating in the clean and practical language she had always used for risk assessments that my survival was not an acceptable outcome. Then the sounds that followed, and then after a long interval, Gavin's voice arriving from above, unhurried, already accounting for title patterns and search boundaries and how much time they would need to wait before the trust threshold could be crossed. Nobody moved while the recording played. I watched Lydia's face during the passage where her own voice filled the hall. She turned to look at Gavin with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that the person standing beside them had lied about something that mattered more than she had realized. I then opened the second file Phoebe had prepared, the reconstructed transfer plan, mapping the offshore fund, the patent liquidation schedule, and the liability structure that positioned Lydia's name to absorb the legal exposure once the assets had moved beyond reach. Lydia looked at the summary on the screen for a long moment. Gavin told her to say nothing. She said quite a lot. She confirmed the relationship, the financial transfers, and what had happened at Astor Point. She framed him as the architect and herself as someone drawn incrementally into something she had not fully understood at the outset. The recording made that framing difficult to maintain with any coherence, but she advanced it anyway because it was the strongest available position, and she had always been precise about identifying those. Gavin moved toward the far exit. The court officer and two others were already positioned there. I stood beneath the portrait they had hung in my memory and said to the room, and to no one in particular, that I had not come back to recover what had been taken. I had come back because the only alternative was to live out whatever remained of my life inside a version of my own story that someone else had authored, and I had not survived a fall from a cliff in the fog, or 8 months of not knowing my own name, or a year of being dead to the world in order to do that. Gavin and Lydia were arrested that afternoon. Gavin carried the greater criminal weight. He had been the one to remove my fingers from the root, to manage the false search narrative, to continue threatening me after he discovered I had survived. Lydia cooperated fully with investigators, surrendered the offshore accounts, and received a reduced sentence that nonetheless could not undo what the recording had already established about her participation. I restructured ArcLight's board, separated ownership from executive authority, and required independent external audits on every significant transaction going forward. The Hensley Founder Trust was rewritten so that no individual spouse, family member, or long-serving colleague could assume automatic control under any circumstance. I sold the house Gavin and I had shared and used a portion of the proceeds to establish the Open Sky Recovery Network, a program built to support people navigating the aftermath of financial fraud, intimate partner control, and the particular kind of damage that comes from being betrayed by someone who understood precisely where your trust was most concentrated. Iris became an advisor to the network's community health program. Holden received a formal investment, not a gift, because I was not willing to convert what they had given me into a transaction to establish a coastal rescue service at Astor Point. Sometime later, I went back to the cliff with both of them. I stood at a distance from the edge. The place still produced a physical response I couldn't fully override, a tightening across the chest and shoulders that arrived before thought did. But it no longer held any authority over what I decided to do next. At the launch of the Guardian's completed version, a device now capable of transmitting an emergency signal from any location, including the coastal zones where cellular coverage drops entirely. A journalist asked me what it felt like to have reclaimed my company and my life. I told her the most valuable thing I had recovered was not the patents, the board seat, or the trust structure. It was the right to decide for myself what my own story meant. No one can take that from you. But if you're not paying attention, you can hand it to them without ever realizing it's gone. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt closer to real life than fiction, it might be because betrayal rarely announces itself. It moves quietly through people who know exactly where your trust lives and exactly how much patience it takes to wait for the right moment. What Olivia's story asks us to consider is not just what we would do in her position, but what we might already be missing in our own. The work of paying attention is never finished. If these are the kinds of stories worth telling, subscribe so you're there when the next one arrives.